So just before we get started, we're going to go through just some house cleaning items, how you participate in this webinar. I know that everybody else is on mute. I'm the only one that's speaking, and as a result, it may seem like it would be difficult to ask questions, and not the case. There's actually a questions component that's part of the webinar GoToWebinar interface that you can use to ask questions. You type them in. On my end, we have a few folks on staff that are here to answer and field questions appropriately for you throughout the course of the webinar this morning. That looks like this. Ask questions, as you can see here. If you look at the GoToWebinar interface, it's docked on one side of your screen. There's a little question component. You enter in your question, and somebody on the staff will answer the question for you. If it's a question that we can't answer real time in the course of the webinar, then we'll probably just ask you to go ahead and send in a support ticket to support@pubnub.com. And that will be routed through our support channels, and myself or Craig or somebody else on staff will get back to you as quickly as we can. Okay. All right. We're going to take a couple seconds just to go over PubNub as a whole. It's something we do with all these webinars. For those that are new to PubNub, PubNub is a globally distributed and replicated real-time data stream network. What that means is that if you're doing real-time enablement of your solution and you need that solution to scale on a large scale, we're going to provide the easiest, most reliable, and far less costly route for you to do so. Not only that, we support SDKs, 70 plus SDKs across several different platforms. So chances are, if your solution is running on a device or on an OS that has HTTP capable TCP IP stack, you can communicate with PubNub, and we probably have an SDK for you to use already. Our services are broken down into various components. At the core of our service is publish and subscribe. What we allow you to do is publish messages and signals to what we call channels, and then subscribers can subscribe to those channels and retrieve those messages real time, and that's the core piece of our service. In addition to that, we have components such as Stream Controller that allow you to aggregate data from several different channels into one stream. So if you think kind of the Twitter concept of a microblog concept where everybody's posting into various entry points, Stream Controller allows you to aggregate all that and pull it down as one channel. We give you the ability to monitor who's on a channel, who's subscribed to a channel real time, and when they leave a channel, so that you know who is using your app and you can interact with them. We also give you the ability to do storage and playback. Storage and playback allows you to retrieve messages that might have been published in the past, but you may need to grab them in order to recreate the state of the application or in order to do any kind of analytics on your own. Today, we're going to be going over the mobile push gateway. So the mobile push gateway allows you to integrate in a non-intrusive way push notifications into your solution. We'll be looking at that today. And then finally, we have Access Manager. Access Manager allows you to lock down access to the channels that you're sending data to and determine who has access to read, write, and manage those channels. And then last but not least, real-time analytics. Any solution that you have out there nowadays in the cloud, you're going to want to take a look in to the analytics of that solution, determine how it's performing and how it might change. And real-time analytics dashboard gives you that capability to monitor traffic to your solution and determine where that traffic's originating, what your peak times are, and what your volume is. Okay. So jumping right into it, I'm hoping most folks here on the webinar have used PubNub in the past. We're going to cover an aspect of PubNub today, which is the mobile push gateway. We're not going to cover the publish and subscribe or stream controller or access manager. Those are things that we do cover in other webinars. Today, we're going to focus in on push notifications and enabling the mobile push gateway, configuring your application, and building an app that uses push notifications. Okay, so we're going to kind of break that down into several different steps. One is, what is the push gateway? After we understand what the gateway is, there we're going to look at configuring the gateway for both GCM and iOS. GCM is Google Cloud Messaging, and iOS, obviously, that's Apple. And it actually should say APNS, or Apple Push Notification Services. There's configuration that you need to do for both providers, and we'll walk through that. Then we're going to look at building a small Cordova. And for those of you that may not know, Cordova, PhoneGap are essentially the same thing. There are some minor differences there, but we're going to build a Cordova application that plugs into the mobile push gateway and allows your application to receive a push. And then we'll look at what it takes to send a push, and then a few troubleshooting and diagnostic tricks. There's not a whole lot of code in this particular webinar. There's a little bit of code. It's just enough code to get a push notification sent from some application to your Cordova-based app on your mobile device and show that push notification. And in fact, the Cordova app doesn't even use the PubNub SDK, which is kind of a key point of the mobile push gateway. Okay. So what is the mobile push gateway? So this is showing you what the gateway is. When we talk about push notifications, PubNub doesn't actually deliver push notifications to devices. We're a gateway. So what that means is when you want to send a push, we act kind of as the UN translator for that push notification. You send it to PubNub. PubNub looks at that push notification and determines which service provider it needs to go down to. And then that service provider receives that push and delivers it to your device. And this diagram here is showing you that we have some interactions. Red is the app, and blue is the push gateway. So once the app is started on the device, the application registers with the service provider. Okay, so you can kind of think of that as the app tagging a translator. Okay. The app receives a device token from the service provider because the app is running on the device, knows the device, and says, I want to receive push notifications. The service provider returns a device token. And then the app associates that device token with one or more PubNub channels. So essentially on number 4, what we're saying is that the application is going to let PubNub know about this particular device and associate that device with one or more PubNub channels, so that when a push notification is sent on one of those channels, PubNub knows to then forward that onto the service provider, and the service provider will then deliver that to your application. Okay. Another way to look at it, we have our app here. The app sends a push notification through PubNub with the mobile gateway enabled. The mobile gateway then inspects the payload that the app sends out, and when it determines that the payload contains a push notification, it will forward that push notification to the proper service provider, and the service provider will then deliver that push notification to the actual device. Okay. Okay, so that's the mobile push gateway. Key point with the gateway is it is a gateway. We do not deliver push notifications to devices. We pull the push notification out of payloads that you're sending us. We forward that on to the service provider on your behalf, and allows you to transparently integrate push capabilities into your application that interact with not only one push service providers such as Google or GCM, but APNS and Windows Phone as well. So you can send a push to all 3 device types with one function call. versus having to interact with each individual service provider in a roll your own solution or other solutions. Okay. To get all this set up, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to tell PubNub how to talk to these service providers, and that's what we're going to look at now. So first, we're going to look at configuring a GCM, setting up GCM. We're going to look at setting up iOS, and then we'll start looking at the Cordova application. And I'm going to pause here, see if we have any questions. Okay, I think we have some of those in there. Okay, so enabling the push gateway. So enabling the push gateway is fairly simple, and I'm going to actually jump out of the slides and go into the browser and just walk you through this. It'd be a little bit quicker. All right. So from PubNub.com, you're going to want to log in to your account. And I'm going to log in this way here. And when you're in your account, you're in your dashboard, it's going to show you the apps that you have created. Here at the top, there's a menu with apps. I'm going to select an app called Cordova Push that I created. And then it shows me the keys that are associated with that app. And I'm going to select the key that's there. And that will pull that app up here so that I can configure that application. So I'm looking at the right app, I'm looking at the right key, and so on. If I scroll down, there are various features that I can enable for that particular key. One of those features is push notifications. And if you do not have it enabled, it'll have a little button that says enabled. You'll want to go ahead and click on that, and then you'll have two different options. You can disable the feature if you're no longer using it, or you can configure the feature if you're ready to set things up. We're going to click on configure. Configuring the push notification for GCM is the process of supplying the correct API key to GCM, or that you obtain from GCM to PubNub. And what that does is it tells PubNub when you want to send a push notification to GCM, use this API key, and that identifies you to the GCM service. Okay, it's pretty straightforward to get a API key. In my case, I have a solution out here at Google Developer Console called Cordova PubNubless. Sorry. Picked a lot of hard names this morning for some reason. And what I have here is I've enabled API on that solution, and it's Google Cloud Messaging for Android. So you want to enable the API. Once you enable the API, you're going to create credentials. You just want to click on Add Credentials, API key. And it's going to show you a dialog box here that allows you to generate various types of API keys. For PubNub, you're going to want to choose server key. Server key, give the server key a name. You do not need to whitelist or provide any additional API IPs here for this particular key. At least from a PubNub perspective, there's no reason to do that. For your given solution, you may or may not want to supply a filter. If you are going to supply IP addresses here, we do have a whitelist that we can provide you. Okay, but once you have your key, go ahead and do a create. You'll get your dialog box for that shows your API key. You just want to copy that value and then go back over to your console and supply it here in your GCM API key. Okay, so that's the kind of the initial configuration steps that you need to follow in order to set up GCM or Google Cloud Messaging with PubNub. Okay. Once you have that API key there, you're just going to want to say OK. If the API key is accepted, you'll get that dialog and everything will work. If that API key is not accepted, the dialog will actually show you an error message. And then at that point, you probably just either want to send a ticket in to support@pubnub.com or just recreate the key. A lot of times you may have mistakenly generated the wrong type of key. Maybe go back, regenerate the key, and try a different key. Okay. But once you have that push notification enabled and you've added your API key, at that point, PubNub now knows how to talk to GCM on your behalf. Okay. So let's go back over here. So again, enable push notifications. Once you enable push notifications, you're going to want to jump out to console.developers.android.com, create a new project, enable the cloud messaging API. From credentials, generate an API key, and no need to change any of the default values. And I think the screenshots here just take you through that. Again, here's the Google Developers Console. There's the solution that I created. Project number is also called the sender ID. I put that in here for a specific purpose. I'll get back to that in just a second. From the API navigation, you want to enable Google Cloud Messaging. Just make sure that it is enabled. And then you want to generate from credentials, generate an API key, make sure it's a server key. Okay. This is the server key dialog. You can give the server key a name. You typically, or you can only associate one API key with a subkey within PubNub. So you'll probably, in the course of your development, have several PubNub keys and several API keys, one for development, one for integration testing and production, and so on. So I would just name the key appropriately, just so you know where that key is actually being used. It can get very confusing having several keys in use and not knowing which PubNub keys they've been associated with. Okay. But once you create your key, just go ahead and copy it. And at that point, GCM and PubNub know how to talk to each other on your behalf. Okay. For iOS, it's going to be quite a bit different. iOS is a much more involved process, and you need to create an app ID and then create a CSR and so on. And I'm going to take you through that in screenshot format here. Very first thing you're going to want to do, as most of you iOS developers know, you're going to need an account on developer.apple.com and be an iPhone or an iOS developer. You're going to want to create an app ID. Okay. And an app ID on the iOS side is synonymous to an app on the Android side. Okay. Once you create the app ID, you're going to want to create a certificate request using the keychain access, and I can just show you that. Once you create an app ID on apple.com, the next thing you're going to want to do, and I'm going to pop up to developer.apple.com right here in Safari so we can get that guy up. If you're up at apple.com, and this is my own account, but once you have your app, you're going to want to create your app ID as I did here, PN Cordova push. And when you create your app ID, you're going to have some options to enable various features. If you scroll down to the bottom here, one of those features is going to be push notifications. It's listed here. It is enabled on development, and it's configurable. You can go into edit, From Edit, you get the option to configure those features. So now that I scroll down to that app ID, I have push notifications, it's enabled. I can choose, I've already created a certificate for this particular app ID, but if this is the first time you're coming into the screen, you're gonna have the option to create a certificate. Okay, well, to do that, the first thing you're gonna wanna do is go back over to Keychain and generate a CSR, or certificate signing request. Okay, so the way I do that is select a CA, and I have my own personal CA here. It's a development CA. Request a certificate from a certificate authority with, and it'll have some name. When I select that, it's going to pop up a dialog box. I'm going to give it an email address of the certificate authority, which for me, it's just going to be my email address. And you're going to want to choose Save to Disk. Okay. When you do that, it will generate a CSR. It'll ask you where to save that to, and I'm going to put it out here on my desktop. And now I have my CSR. Now that I have a certificate signing request, I'm going to associate that creator certificate within the Apple developer site using that request. So when I select Create Certificate, Continue, now it's going to ask me for that signing request. So I'm just going to select that. I'll go back to desktop. Let's get over there. That's better. Upload my certificate signing request. Click Generate. That's going to generate my certificate. Now I can download that certificate. And that downloads to your download folder. And once you've downloaded that certificate, you double click on that certificate and it will launch Keychain again. And it will import that cert for you. Okay. And once you've imported that cert, the next thing you're going to want to do is actually export the certificate as a P12. So if you right click on it, click export, you'll get a dialog box that asks you where you want to save that P12. This is the private key. You want to give it a name. So demo P12, and I'm going to actually put that in that same little directory. And it's asking me for a password. This is where you're going to set a password on the certificate. You do not need to set a password on the certificate. If this dialog is blank, then you can just leave it blank and it won't set a password, but you are welcome to set a password. If you do set a password, just make sure it's something that you're going to remember, because you'll need it when you install the certificate in the PubNub console. So I'm just going to click OK. Now it's asking for my password. And what that did is export the P12 file for me. Now that I have the P12 file, I'm going to convert it to a PIM. So and you're typically going to do that. Using OpenSSL. And it takes a couple parameters here. Using the OpenSSL, you can take the P12 file and produce a PEM file, which is what you'll install in the console. And these are documented as well. We'll get back to that. Yep. There you go. If you didn't set a password when you created it, don't supply one when it prompts you for the password. But that'll actually create your PEM file, and you are good to go. At this point, you need to install this in the PubNub console. So next step would be going back over. And just choosing the file and doing an upload, which I've already done, so I'm not going to re-upload it. But you would just choose that PEM file, it would upload, and then you would have a screen that looks similar to this. It will show you when that certificate expires and whether or not it's development. The cert that I generated was a development certification, so I would select cert development here. If I had a password on that certificate, I would supply that. And if those two things match up, then it will be able to pull that certificate in for you, okay? And at that point, now, not only do we have the mobile gateway enabled, we have it talking to GCM using the API key, and we also have it interacting with APNS because we have our certificate. So at this point, PubNub's ready to start sending push notifications on your behalf, and we can start looking at the application side and how you receive a push notification. We pivot from sending to receive because you have to have these steps done prior to receiving a push notification, but you really only have to have some of this for sending a push notification. Okay, so now we're going to pop back over to the slides here. So again, configuring iOS, generate your app ID. Once you have your app ID, create your certificate signing request, and that can be done with the keychain access. Just right-click on your private key and do or right-click on your CA, which you'll probably have a CA there, and choose request a certificate from a certificate authority. Once you have that certificate signing request, the CSR, you'll want to go back into developer.apple.com and actually create a certificate. Click there. Once you create click on create a certificate, it will ask you for that CSR. Upload that CSR at that point. That will generate a certificate for you. You want to download that certificate, double click it, it will open back up in keychain access. Export that certificate as a P12. Okay? Then convert that P12 to a PEM, okay? Once you have the PEM, head back to the PubNub developer console, select the correct application and key, make sure that push notifications is enabled, click configure, upload the certificate into the PubNub developer console. At that point, you have a fully configured mobile push gateway. Okay. If everything works out, you should see a screen similar to this. Okay, so now we have the gateway interacting with the service provider. Let's start looking at how do you build an application. So the application that I have for you today, like I said, doesn't even use the PubNub SDK. There's no need to use the PubNub SDK when you're just using push notification. It's not likely that you're going to have a solution that only uses push notification, but I wanted to separate the core PubSub capabilities from push notifications because they're very, very different. Core PubSub goes through PubNub, and as we said earlier, the mobile push gateway actually just intercepts payloads that contain push notifications and forwards them to a service provider, and the service provider actually does the delivery of that push notification. So the app we have today is just assuming that it's going to receive a push notification from a service provider. It doesn't really know where that push notification originated from. Okay, so we're going to do that with Cordova. And it's a very, very plain application, but it is just enough to get you started. It is out there in GitHub, and I think everybody was given a link to this repository. So please feel free to download it and check it out. If you run into an issue, send in a support ticket at support.pubnub.com. I'd love to keep it up to date, make sure it works for you. Okay. Getting Cordova. So the very first thing you're going to want to do, and I've already done all these things locally, but you're going to want to install Cordova. In order to install Cordova, you're going to need the Node package manager. So if you don't have Node installed, you'll want to go back and install Node so that you can get npm, and then you'll use npm to install Cordova. Okay, and you do that for those on Mac or Linux flavored machines. It's going to be sudo npm install Cordova. And then once you have that installed, you should have the ability to create an application at that point. Before you do, you'll also want to make sure that you have the Android SDK installed and any iOS development tools installed that you may want to use. Behind the scenes, Cordova actually creates native applications or a container, native application container, in which your HTML5 apps run. So you want to have all those prerequisites in place prior to creating your app. It'll just make the scripts run a little bit smoother for you. Okay. So to create an application, it's pretty straightforward. Cordova create what directory you want to create the app in. So that's the dot there. And then you have the ID, which is usually a reverse domain name. And then the name of the app itself. So PN Cordova push. After you create the app, you're going to want to install a couple plugins. And I'm going to just pop out of the slides here and we'll kind of walk through some of that. And then we'll back it up with the slides. I'm going to jump over here. So my local box here, I'm just going to say Cordova. My local box, I have a Cordova app. So if I just created a Cordova app, I would have a directory structure very, very similar to this. However, you won't have the folder publisher. That's an app that I'm using to publish a push out that we'll see in just a couple minutes. But the rest of this is pretty much a plain Jane Cordova application. Okay. The very first thing I'm going to want to do after I run the Cordova Create app is start installing a few of the plugins. I've already done that here, and the commands are in the slides, but just to show you which plugins I'm actually using. There's a device plugin out there. The device plugin on Cordova allows you to retrieve device information within your JavaScript. Okay, and we need to know which platform we're dealing with so that we know which way to register a device with PubNub. So I'm using that. The whitelist, this should actually be added by default for you when you create your Cordova app. If you're using earlier versions of Cordova, you may not have this plugin. You may need to install it. But the whitelist is a security plugin that allows you to control at a granular level where you can actually connect to internet resources. Okay, and then you have the PhoneGap push plugin. As I said, we're a gateway, so we don't deliver push. In order to receive a push notification on a mobile device, you need to provision your application and configure your application such that the OS knows that your application intends to receive push notifications. And when you're using a cross-platform framework such as Cordova that is essentially HTML and JavaScript, in order to receive a push notification, you have to have some kind of a native component behind that that tells the OS we want to receive push notifications. Well, for Cordova or PhoneGap, that's going to be the push plugin. There are also several other plugins out there that interact well with Angular, Iconic, and React. So I'm using push plugin because it's the easiest one and it's the most plain, straightforward plugin I could find, but there are other ways to skin the cat. But you need to have some type of push plugin installed in your project so that you can actually receive push, or you'd have to write your own. Okay, these are the 3 plugins that I'm actually using. Okay, once you have those plugins installed, and the commands for installing that plugin are here on the screen. Just Cordova plugin install. Okay. Once you have those plugins installed, you're pretty much good to go. You've got an application, you have everything configured on the server side, and you have your push plugin installed. Okay. The next thing you're going to want to do is actually modify the index HTML file. So I'm going to jump out and do that. So here's my project, my directory structure, and within the www folder is where all the HTML and JavaScript is. There's an index HTML file here. This was generated for you when you created the app. It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to make this bigger. Not a lot here. There's one thing I do want to point out. There is a meta tag up here, which is a security tag or an extra layer of security that you'll probably want to keep in place on any type of production app. But it essentially will control what kind of network request can originate from this particular page. Okay, and there are several different options, and they are documented. And this is part of that whitelist plugin. Okay, I have it commented out here because I didn't need it, but it's probably something you do want to leave in place. Scrolling down through the body, at the bottom of the body, I have a couple imports of JavaScript files. Namely, in this particular case, it's going to be the Cordova JS, which imports the Cordova framework. And then I have the push notification.js, which imports that push notification plugin. Okay. And then I have my app, which is in index.js. Okay. Once I have that, I should run the application and just check to make sure everything's running and that I see what I think I should see on the screen. Okay. You can run the app with Android or iOS, whichever way you want to do it. I'm already running the app, so I'm just going to do it that way right now. All right. Let's hop in here real quick. So the next thing that we're going to look at is index.js. Index.js is the application file itself. So we imported everything into the index HTML. That's going to run whenever this page actually loads. And one of those files that is going to be loaded and processed is the index.js that's in the JS folder. And again, this is based on the boilerplate pre-generated Cordova app. So a lot of this code might look familiar to you if you've done Cordova in the past. The key method that we're going to want to pay attention to is going to be the on-device ready. On-device ready is an event that's going to be fired off by the Cordova framework or PhoneGap framework when the device, when you can start to manipulate DOM elements and plugins within the Cordova framework. Okay, don't try to do anything prior to this event because nothing will be available. It's just PhoneGap 101. Everything starts after this occurs. All right. The push plugin. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to initialize the push plugin, and the way we're going to do that is by using some options, just an options hash here. We supply the options hash with various attributes for Android and for iOS. For the Android side, it's just specifying the sender ID, and that will allow you to send push notifications from the app. And then on the iOS side, just some options on how you want the push plugin to handle the notifications for you. And then there are some for Windows as well. I don't know a lot about the Windows push notifications, but for the push plugin, they are enumerated on the GitHub site in a nice table. So you can actually navigate there and you'll get nice documentation on what options are available. But once I have this options hash, ignore that just for a second. I'm going to call push notification init. That initializes the push plugin for you and returns a reference to push. I have a anonymous inner function here that's going to register my device with PubNub. We'll get back to that in just a second. But the next thing we're going to want to do is you're going to use the event stream that the push plugin offers, and we're going to say when registration event occurs, which will happen very shortly after the application boots. Execute this callback. And what I'm doing here is I'm printing out the registration ID and or device token. Each device and within each app on each device, you will ask the service provider for a device token or push token or registration ID. They're referred to as all three, so just be aware. And the push plugin has a callback for that. So behind the scenes, what the push plugin is actually doing is telling the OS, I want to receive push notifications, and then asking Google, in this Google or iOS or APNS, for a device token. And the service provider is going to say, here's a token that you can use to identify that particular device for that particular application. And that's what we're getting right here. Now, how do we tell PubNub about this device? The next thing we're going to want to do is say, given this device ID, I want to register it with one or more channels on the PubNub side. So I'm doing that here in register with PubNub, okay? And so that register with PubNub function is very, very straightforward. And we'll look at the REST API a little bit more towards the end of the webinar, but we have register with PubNub. We give it our subscribe key, a comma delimited list of channels. So this could actually be channel 1, channel 2, so on. I'm just using one channel for this particular example. It needs to be S. So we have Cordova push, registration type, and what I'm doing here is checking the OS. And if the OS is Android, then the registration type is going to be GCM. Otherwise, it'll be APNS. I'm only supporting iOS and GCM. You may want to be a little bit more elaborate on how you determine which platform you're dealing with. But you know, at the basic level, this is what you need. Okay. Then I'm going to call REST API on the PubNub side, and this particular method or this particular REST API is wrapped in a method in the JavaScript SDK, and I could take you back to that, but it's a very straightforward method to implement external to the SDK, so I have it here as well. We're going to hit push subkey, supply the subkey, devices, that registration token. So this is where we're telling PubNub about this particular device for that particular application, and we're going to add that device. The operation type is add equals channel name. So we're going to register it with the Cordova push, and we're telling PubNub that this device type is actually whatever registration type is. And what that results in is PubNub now knows that this particular device, in this particular case an Android device, is going to be registered to receive push notifications that are published against the Cordova push channel for this subkey. Okay, so what will happen when a push notification is sent is PubNub will look at that payload, grab that push notification, send it to the service provider, and your device will actually get the push notification. Okay, so that's registration. That is the end of configuring the push gateway. Okay, is registering your device with PubNub. Now, the registration IDs can and do change. So you do want to look at the registration ID or retrieve a registration ID every time your app is run. And if your registration ID changes, you want to re-register it with PubNub. You don't have to take the old one off, although you can do that as well, but you can re-register the new key with PubNub. And that way your device will continue to get push notifications. So I want to stress that again because I've seen it a couple times. These registration IDs can change. So you do want to check it every time the application's run and register with PubNub as necessary. Okay. The next thing, the next event within that push plugin is going to actually be the notification. Notification is going to execute within the application whenever a remote notification is received or whenever a push notification is received. And in this particular case, all I'm doing is just logging it out, and then I'm creating a card on the screen, and I'm setting that up so that you can view it. Very, very straightforward. Now, if the application isn't running, the push plugin will actually take care of creating the notification in the notification area and allowing your user to see that. So you don't actually have to do anything to see the push notification. The push plugin does that for you. Okay, and there are several options that the push plugin gives you to determine what format that push notification is rendered as. Right. And then there's the last the last event that the push plugin has is error. When an error occurs, and that would typically be through registration or some other problem with configuring the application. Okay. All right. So let's go take a look at the actual app itself. And it's going to take just a second because I'm using a screen share. And I want to make sure that the screen share is actually on. So push notifications only work on physical devices. You can't do a push notification on an emulator or a simulator. So what I'm doing is I'm using an app on my personal Android device that will broadcast the screen through a browser tab. And it'll just take me a second to get it up and running here. That's my screen. And the next thing we're going to do is just start the app. So I have that Cordova app, the code that we just walked through on the device. I'm just going to go ahead and boot it up. And you'll see the output. So very, very basic. We just have here at the top where it says platform, that tells me what platform it is. And the device plugin doesn't give me options or data for every attribute on every platform. The device plugin actually gives me the platform consistently and nothing else. So the two undefined there are just the device plugin doesn't give me any values there. Down here at the bottom, we have our device registration ID. This identifies this particular device for this particular app to the service provider, which would be Google Cloud Messaging in this case, or APNS, same concept. Okay, and then the registration status. So we got the token, we hit that register with PubNub, and my status is that I've registered with this particular channel for GCM, and result 1 modified channels. That's the result you'll get when you actually register a device token with a channel. Okay, so the next thing I'd want to do is actually send a push notification. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I have a little app over here. And we'll get to that app in just a second. But that's going to send your push notification, and then what you'll see on the screen, assuming that the broadcasting still works, and it does, is down here you've got a push notification. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, that's while I'm in the application. This is how the push plugin does it. While I'm in the application, it called my rendering, and you didn't get a notification at the top of the screen. But if I jump out of the app and I send another push, and this sometimes takes a second, but there it goes. And so I just sent the second push, and you see the push notification on the screen. Okay? And that will take me back into my app where I can do whatever I need to do. Okay? Very straightforward. There's not a lot of code. Again, this application doesn't use a PubNub SDK. Now I'm publishing the push notification through PubNub, but as far as receiving the push notification, there's no real tie or dependency there on PubNub other than registering the device with the channel so that you can receive a push notification. Okay. All right. So just run back through. We added the push notification to our HTML. We imported the push notification JavaScript file. We established some default options for the push notification plugin. We initialized that plugin. We overrode or provided an implementation for each one of the events, or a callback for each one of the events. Okay. Registration, just to reiterate, the device ID that identifies this particular device for this particular app to the service provider is sent to this registration event callback. Okay, they can change, so you do want to run this every time your application runs and either compare it with the previous ID that you had by storing that in local preferences, or store the previous ID somewhere within your app and compare it with what you have. And if it changed, re-register with PubNub. Okay. Notification is an event that's going to be called when you receive a push notification. It's going to be called when the app is in the foreground or in the background. The difference is when the app is in the foreground, in this particular case for the push notification, it's not rendering the card view in the notification area, but when the application is in the background, it does. Okay, but this will be called for every push notification received. Okay. All right, and then there's error, and we didn't have a slide for that one. Okay. All right, so far, just to kind of review, we've configured the gateway. The gateway stands between your application and the various push providers. So we've configured that by supplying our API key and our certificate inside of the PubNub console, and said that we wanted to use mobile push gateway for a particular subscribe key. We went through that. We built a Cordova application that uses very little PubNub dependency, or has very little dependency on PubNub, but that application does boot up, retrieves a registration ID from the various service providers, and then registers that registration ID with PubNub channels. And in our case, it's just the Cordova push channel. And what we're saying is that whenever there's a push notification sent on that channel, I want this particular device to receive it. Okay. Now, if you're using regular PubSub, you're going to, and you send a push plus a PubSub message in one payload, you'll receive both within your application. I'll talk about that in just a second. All right, so now we're to the point, we've got our app to receive a push notification, we're gonna send a push notification. Sending a push notification is very, very straightforward, and I have a very tiny app here to do that. The requirement is that you must have one or more devices associated with the channel, which is what we did in the register PubNub, and the JSON that you're publishing must contain a proper push notification attribute. And I have a few samples here. For GCM, this would be a typical GCM payload, okay? And this is actually not the best payload, but it does work. Let me jump out. Go into Sublime here. Let's look at our publisher. I do have a folder here for Publisher that has a very simple sample application to publish a push notification. And here it is. So we just initialize PubNub. Now this is a node-based app that you would just run off to the side that publishes some push notifications. But here I initialize PubNub. We'll get back to this in just a second. Then I create my payload down here. So I'm going to make that a little bigger. So the GCM payload typically has a data tag. Then within data, you can have any number of attributes that will be sent along with your push notification and usable in your application. Okay, so in our case, it's just message and title. And if we go back to the index.json JavaScript, you can see that when I receive a push notification on the device, I'm looking for an attribute called message and title. But that very well could have been any other payload that I could imagine that meets my use case. Okay. For AP&S, it's slightly different. There's an AP&S format. I have alert, title, body. They're a little bit more prescriptive on the iOS side with what needs to go into the payload, and this is really being enforced by Apple or GCM, not PubNub. We just take the information and forward it. But they are a little bit more prescriptive on that side. So you want to be very careful with these payloads. And here we have title and body, and a badge count. Okay. Then I wrap that in a message. So here I have a message that has an attribute called MSG message. That's a regular pub sub message. So I'm publishing to this particular channel. This is a regular pub sub message, and I'm also adding at the same time 2 push payloads. Okay, the AP&S and the GCM. Okay. Those 2 payloads will be intercepted by PubNub, the mobile push gateway, and at that point, if everything's configured appropriately, it will forward that push notification to the service providers, and the service provider will then deliver the push notification to the device. Okay, and then here's old friend publish channel, the message, which is this guy here, and then I have an error and a callback. Okay, so when I just sent those 2 push notifications a few minutes ago, this is the app that I'm using to do that. It's very, very basic, but it's actually just not a complex area. The hardest part with push notifications is getting everything configured and getting your application provisioned appropriately. And then understanding that there's a difference between PubSub and push notification. Push notifications are typically used when you have an application that has time-sensitive data, and you need a user to interact with the application whenever particular events occur. However, you don't know if the application is running, if they're online or offline. At that point, you could use a push notification to tickle the user or prompt the user to open up your application. Okay, so with publish, we just tie in the push that we want, send it off, and away we go. All right, so just to back that up there. So Google Cloud Messaging, they have various payload requirements, PN_GCM. There's a few flags here we'll get to in just a second, but data. And you can find additional attributes that can go into your payload at this website. I think I do actually have it pulled up. Yeah, so this is that website. And there are various different types of payloads that will determine how the push is handled by the operating system that you can add to your payload. We don't put any constraints on what can be there. So if it's something that you can add based on the documentation here in GCM, then you can add that to your push payload. It's not going to be affected. Okay. All right. And for the Apple side, very, very similar. If we go back over to the slide there, For the Apple side, it's very similar. It's just pn_apns, and then alert. As we said, it's slightly different. The data that you want in the push, and then your badge count. And you can find more information about the attributes that you can add to your payload at the site here, which I also have up on the screen here. Okay, a lot of these are the same, GCM versus iOS. You'll find there's a lot of overlap between the two, but there are some differences as well. So not too difficult. You just need to make sure you adhere to the documentation that GCM has or iOS has for those payloads to ensure that your payload is going to be delivered. Because one of the other big points of confusion or difficult parts with push notifications is because we're a gateway, we're taking that push notification out of that payload and sending it along to the service provider. If the service provider then says, I don't want to send this push notification because there's some kind of an issue with that payload, getting that kind of diagnostic information is difficult to do. Google doesn't provide a whole lot of feedback for what's wrong with a push. You can have any number of problems, from payload issues to API key being rejected to server being blacklisted. There are various things that could happen to your push payload. So you want to be very careful about that. And for dealing with those particular situations, let's see here. We already kind of went through that. We have some troubleshooting and diagnostic things that you can use, tools that you can use. PnDebug. Okay, PnDebug is a channel that's created for you when you're using push notifications or a mobile push gateway. And what this channel will do for you is allow you to receive diagnostic information from the mobile push gateway on events that occur. So if you were sending a push notification and you wanted to see if PubNub picked up that push notification, then you can actually subscribe to PnDebug, and it would be whatever channel you're sending the push notification on, -PnDebug, and diagnostic information will be displayed for you. And if you go back over to the little sample app I had there, very, very basic one, I am actually subscribing to that. Okay, so if there's any output that comes off of that channel, that output would be displayed on the console. Okay. All right. PnDebug, very, very important. You can also log into the PubNub Developer Console. Okay, there. Go into. You can use the PubNub Developer Console, and you can supply your subscribe key, publish key, the channel, and various other options, and do subscribe here and listen for diagnostic information that way as well. Okay. Sometimes it's nice to actually subscribe if you're publishing from a server. Just subscribe to that channel, and then you can integrate that output into your logs, which will give you kind of a nice chronological list of events that occur as you're publishing a push notification. The next diagnostic tool that we have, and I wouldn't quite call it a diagnostic tool, but it is there, is the REST API that we use behind the scenes to register and deregister devices. You can register a device using this particular REST API, and it's probably a little difficult to follow it on a slide like this, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to go through the path, but there are some options and arguments that you pass in to this particular REST API that will add or remove a device from a given channel. Okay, and that's primarily the operation that you're going to perform when telling a device or telling PubNub about a particular device is adding and removing it from a channel. Okay, these slides are going to be made available to you. We can also give you a list of these REST APIs if you send in a ticket to support at pubnub.com. So we're happy to do that. But this will allow you to see if devices are there and allow you to add and remove a device. Okay. The next one is to see which channels a given device is registered to receive push notifications on. And that's slightly different if I had a physical device and I wanted to see which channels this device was registered on. I could use this REST API and it will give me a list of those channels. Okay. The reason why these two are important is I would say 8 out of 10 times if a push notification is not showing up, one of the primary causes is the device not being registered with PubNub. Okay, if you have the mobile push gateway configured and you've established the interaction via the API key in your certificate to tell the mobile push gateway how to interact with the service provider, then the next thing that you have to do is register a device. And many times, either that step is not being done or it's done too early in the process. And as a result, the device ID isn't there when you call register, and it errors out. These two REST APIs or two REST endpoints will allow you to very quickly go in to your solution and pull up a list of the channels or devices that are registered, so you can determine if that step has actually been done successfully. Okay, which is why I added them here. Okay, so between P and debug, when you publish a push, you want to subscribe to the -p and debug channel. You'll get some diagnostic output. And then if you don't get enough diagnostic output to resolve your problem at that point, then you probably want to use the REST API, and that will give you additional information. And then, as always, there's support at pubnub.com that you can send a ticket in, and we'd love to help you. We can go through and pull push logs and show you what's going on. Okay. All right, so just some top issues, just to wrap up here. Top issues: confusing PubNub with PubSub with push. Okay, or confusing PubNub PubSub with push, meaning the publish and subscribe API that you would use in your solution as part of the core service that we have is not push notifications. Okay, so when you receive a push, it's going to go through the operating system's path for receiving push notifications. And that's where your push notification will be sent. In our case, it's to that on notification event that's in Cordova, but behind the scenes, there's actually a receiver, a broadcast receiver that's invoked and passed in that push notification. Okay. On the iOS side, it's off of your app delegate. You have did receive remote notification, but it's not going to go through your subscribe callback. Okay. A lot of times folks will be getting a subscribe callback and they're doing the same thing with the push as they are with their PubSub, and things appear to be working, but they're actually not getting the push notification. So I would highly recommend that as you integrate push with no PubNub to begin with, and then add the PubNub part of it. And that will help you layer things in appropriately so that you can ensure your push notification is working and your PubSub is working as well. Device not being registered with the channel or device token, or the channel is stale. So when you receive your device registration ID, make sure you register that with PubNub, and you probably want to store your device ID in shared preferences or user settings and compare the device ID with what any new device ID with what you had previously. If that device ID changes, you want to make sure to re-register it with PubNub. Otherwise, your device will stop receiving push notifications. Okay. Invalid payload. This is by far the largest or the highest I guess percentage of issues with push is having an invalid payload. If you have an invalid payload and you call publish, it's going to work for you. Obviously, it's going to send that payload along, but the mobile push gateway may not pick it up, And if the mobile push gateway picks it up and forwards it to the service provider and they don't understand it, they're only going to return a very, very silent response to the mobile push gateway. So you'll be sending messages out and they'll just go into a void and you won't know what's happening. So you want to definitely test your payload independent of your application. And there's ways to do that on Google's site. They give you some curl scripts that you can use to send push notifications. Test your payload out. Make sure that your payload is correct if you're not receiving your push notification. And then last but not least, it's just invalid configuration on the receiving end. As I said, a lot of people will confuse PubNub and PubSub with push and not have the proper broadcast receiver installed or proper permissions for the Android side, or not have the right remote notification enabled on the iOS side, and that causes a lot of problems. So the key takeaway on that would be do each step independent of one another, and test as often and as much as you can so that you can ensure each step is working. And then if things don't work, you'll be somewhat confident at what stage things are breaking down. Okay. All right. So knowledge base, just some resources, just to wrap up here. Some resources that we have. We have a knowledge base out there that has a lot of good articles written by several folks here on staff that can guide you through some of the most common troubleshooting and common features that you may want to implement. We have a developer community where you can post and receive responses to questions. We have our support forum, support@pubnub.com. Please feel free to send us a support ticket if you have any question about this or any other feature PubNub has. And we also have docs, demos, and SDKs at the PubNub.com developers. And coming up, I believe it's next Tuesday. Let me jump up to the event site. We have, October 27th. We have our real-time support live question and answer with Craig and Fred. That's myself and Craig Conover, who is the director of support here. And we're actually going to be doing some fun things on that session. This is a session where you can just come with any question, and we'll try to answer that question for you. We're going to send Craig out to run around the building as fast as he can, along with one of our other colleagues. They're going to race around the building while using an application that's tracking their location and taking that location data from their mobile device, publishing it back through the PubNub infrastructure, and allowing us to track the progress of their race from within the webinar. So that should be good fun. And you never know what's going to happen on that particular session. You ask the question, we try to answer, so it can lead to all kinds of fun things. All right. We also have JavaScript and Java webinars coming up here very soon. So if you're interested in attending any of the other webinars, please do visit the events page and you can find out more information on how to register for those webinars. Okay. All right.